Friends of killers? Did something trigger it, or were they always a little off? My best friend from age 6 killed a man with a knife in a bar fight when we were both 22, and the warning signs had been there for 16 years, and I had been not equipped to read them. My friend was named Dexter. Dexter and I had grown up on the same street. We had walked to elementary school together for 6 years. The fight had been at a bar called the Iron Horse. The man Dexter killed was a 34-year-old construction worker named Augustus Whitman, who had been at the bar celebrating his daughter's high school graduation. The first warning sign had been when we were 8. Dexter had been not just angry when a kid named Magnus had taken his pencil at school. Dexter had broken Magnus's finger. Dexter's parents had told the school that Magnus had been the problem. The second warning sign had been when we were 10. Dexter's hamster had died in a way that I had been not letting myself think about for years. Dexter had told me he had killed it because he had been wanting to see what it would feel like. Dexter had said it had felt like nothing. The third sign had been when we were 12. Dexter had been bullying a 6th grader named Octavia. The bullying had been the kind of bullying that suggested Dexter had been figuring out how to break a person without leaving marks. The fourth sign had been at 14. Dexter had brought his father's hunting knife to school. Dexter had just shown it to me and to 2 other friends behind the gym. The showing had been the architecture of letting us know what he was capable of. The fifth sign had been at 16. Dexter had been getting into fights at every party. Dexter had sent another teenager to the hospital with a fractured skull. Dexter's parents had hired an attorney. The case had been settled. The 6th sign had been at 17. Dexter had started using cocaine. Dexter had been not the kind of person who got mellower on drugs. Dexter had been the kind who got faster. The 7th sign had been at 18. Dexter had been kicked out of his first semester of college for fighting a roommate. The 8th sign had been at 19. Dexter had been dating a girl named Petra. Petra had broken up with him after 6 months. Petra had told me afterward that Dexter had been controlling her phone, her clothing, and her friendships. Petra had moved out of state. The 9th sign had been at 20. Dexter had been charged with a felony for a different fight. The charge had been pled down. The 10th sign had been at 21. Dexter had been showing me his knife collection. Dexter had been explaining which knives would do what kinds of damage. The 11th sign had been 30 days before the killing. Dexter had told me he had been wanting to hurt someone. I had assumed Dexter had been venting. I had not done anything about it. The not doing anything had been the thing I have been carrying for the past 11 years. Dexter killed Augustus Whitman at the Iron Horse. The fight had started over a spilled drink. The case was tried as second-degree murder. Dexter's attorney negotiated a manslaughter plea. Dexter received 15 years. I have testified twice in cases involving Dexter. The second was at a parole hearing 2 years ago, where I had been required by the prosecution to describe the warning sign. The asking had been the hardest hour of my life. Whitney Whitman has been a friend of mine for the past 8 years. We met at a victims' rights event where I had been speaking about being the friend of a killer. Whitney's 3 children are now 16, 14, and 11. They know who I am. They have been kind to me. The kindness is more than I deserve. 2 weeks after I wrote that post, I got a letter from Dexter that was different from the others. The letter said his parole hearing had been moved up by 4 months. The letter said he had been a model inmate. Dexter wrote, "I'm not the person I was. You know me better than anyone. You know I'm not that person." And then at the bottom, in handwriting that was more careful than the rest, he wrote, "I need you to come see me. I need you to speak for me at the hearing. You're the only one left." I read that last line 4 times. You're the only one left. Not please. Like I was a tool in a drawer that nobody else had picked up yet. On the 3rd day, I brought it to my therapist. Raina had been working with me for almost 9 years. I handed her the letter and she read it without saying anything. Then she set it down on the table between us and she said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I don't know what I owe him." Raina looked at me. She said, "Is that the real question? Or is the real question what you owe yourself?" I did not answer. Raina said, "You've spent 11 years believing you failed Augustus by staying silent. What would speaking for Dexter now mean?" I thought about it for a long time. I said, "It would mean I learned nothing." That evening I called Whitney. I did not tell her about the letter. Whitney sounded good on the phone. She told me that Josephine, her oldest, had been accepted to a college program. Whitney said, "Augustus would have been so proud. She's graduating the same age he was celebrating when," and then she stopped. I felt the letter in my pocket like it weighed 10 pounds. I decided to visit Dexter. I told myself it was about closure. I needed to look at him across a table and know for sure that the person writing those careful words was the same person who had pulled a knife on a man for asking for an apology. The drive to the facility took 4 hours. I went through security. The visitation room smelled like cleaning product and old coffee. Then a door on the far side of the room opened and Dexter walked in. He looked older. His face was thinner. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there 2 years ago. But then he smiled, and the smile was the same. The exact same smile I had known since we were 6 years old walking to school together. That smile had never changed. Dexter sat down across from me. He put his hands flat on the table. He said, "You came." I said, "I came to hear what you have to say." Dexter leaned forward. His eyes got wet. I watched it happen in real time. His voice got lower, softer. He said, "I think about Augustus every day. I think about what I took from his family. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to tell them I'm different." I watched his hands while he spoke. The hands were steady, completely still on the table. The voice was controlled. The tears looked real. And for one moment, I believed him. For one moment, I was seeing the 6-year-old boy who had knocked on my door that first morning and asked if I wanted to walk to school together. Maybe people really do change. Then Dexter said, "You owe me this. After everything, you were my only real friend. You were the only one who stayed." And I heard it. Right there, underneath the remorse, underneath the wet eyes and the soft voice, the entitlement, the ownership. "You owe me." It was the same exact tone Dexter had used when Petra told me he had been controlling what she wore and who she talked to. It was the sound of a person who believes that other people belong to him. I knew. I knew the way I had always known, and had spent 16 years pretending I did not. I left the visitation room without saying goodbye. My hands were shaking when I got into my car. I was not going to speak for Dexter. I was 40 minutes into the 4-hour drive when my phone rang. The name on the screen was one I had not seen in years. Camelia, Dexter's mother. I almost did not answer, but something made me pick up. Camelia's voice was tight and angry. She said, "I know you visited my son today. He called me right after. He said you were cold. I said, I listened. I just didn't agree. Camelia made a sound. She said, you were like a brother to him. Moses and I treated you like a second son. And now you're going to let him rot because you want to feel like a good person? I said, Camelia, he killed a man. And Camelia said, without missing a beat, it was a bar fight. It could have happened to anyone. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I said, it couldn't have happened to anyone. That's the whole point. I hung up. That was the thing about Dexter's parents. It was never Dexter's fault. It was Magnus's fault for taking the pencil. It was Petra's fault for being too sensitive. It was Augustus's fault for asking for an apology. The fact that Camelia still could not see it after 11 years of her son sitting in a cell told me everything I needed to know about where Dexter had learned that the world owed him something. The following weekend I went to Whitney's house for Josephine's celebration. Mario came out to help me carry the food. Mario was 14 now. He had his father's hands, big and square. Mario grabbed 2 of the bags and looked at me and said, you okay? You look tired. Josephine stood up before we ate and gave a short speech. Josephine said, my dad didn't get to see a lot of my life, but the people in this room made sure I didn't go through it alone. She looked at me when she said it. During dinner, Emerson sat next to me. Emerson was 11 now. He pulled out a notebook and started showing me drawings for a science project about bridges. I felt like a fraud the entire time because the letter was still in the drawer of my nightstand at home. Because I had sat across from the man who killed their father 3 days ago and I had not told any of them. After the kids went to bed, I was helping Whitney clean up in the kitchen. I set down the dish towel. I said, Dexter's parole hearing got moved up. He wants me to speak for him. I went to see him. Whitney's hand stopped in the water. When she turned around, her face had changed. It was something harder than anger. She said, what did you tell him? I said, I didn't tell him anything yet. I went to hear what he had to say. Whitney said, and what did he say? I said, he said he's changed. Whitney was quiet for a long time. Then Whitney said, the man who killed my husband told you he's changed, and you drove 4 hours to hear him say it. I said, I drove 4 hours to see if I could look him in the eye and know for sure, and I can. He hasn't changed. Whitney said, then why didn't you just tell me that first, instead of making me sit here imagining you were considering it? I did not have a good answer. Whitney said, I need a few days. I need to not think about that man's name in my house on the night my daughter just talked about her father. I got my jacket and I left. On the drive home, I called Haven. Haven was my closest friend outside of all of this. I told her what happened. She said, you should have told Whitney before you went. You know that. I said, I know. Haven said, so why didn't you? I said, because I was afraid she'd ask me not to go, and I needed to go. I needed to see him. Part of me needed to make sure I wasn't wrong about him. Part of me needed to make sure I hadn't been unfair for 11 years. Haven said, and? I said, I wasn't wrong. He's the same person. He just got better at the performance. 3 days later, another letter came. The handwriting was different, tight. The letters were small and pressed hard into the page. Dexter wrote that he was disappointed. He wrote, I sat across from you and I opened my heart and you looked at me like I was a case file. I am not a case file. I am your friend. You don't get to throw that away because it makes you uncomfortable. Then I kept reading and my hands went still. Dexter wrote, I know you've been spending time with Whitney Whitman. I know you go to her house. I know her kids' names. People talk in here. And do you think Augustus's wife would still be your friend if she knew you had 30 days warning and did nothing? If she knew you heard me say I wanted to hurt someone and you went home and watched TV? I put the letter down. I picked it up. I read it again. Dexter was not threatening Whitney. He was threatening me. He was positioning himself right between me and the thing I cared about most. He was saying, if you do not help me, I will make sure she knows the truth about you. And the thing that made my stomach feel like it was full of rocks was that the truth he was threatening me with was actually true. I called Raina. When I told her what the letter said, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, he's doing what he has always done. He is finding the thing you care about most and positioning himself between you and it. I said, but he's right. I did have warning. I did nothing. Raina said, you were 22 years old and you did not have the framework to understand what you were seeing. That is not the same as choosing to let it happen. I said, Whitney might not see it that way. Raina said, then Whitney deserves to hear it from you, not from him. I called Whitney. She picked up on the second ring. I said, I need to tell you something, and it's going to be hard to hear, and I need you to hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else. Whitney went quiet. I told her everything. I told her about the 30 days before the killing. I told her that Dexter had said he wanted to hurt someone. I told her that I had assumed it was just talk. I told her I had carried it for 11 years. I told her I had carried it every single time I sat at her kitchen table, and every single time I helped Emerson with his homework. The silence on the phone lasted so long that I pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at the screen. Then Whitney said, you've known this the whole time? I said, yes. Whitney said, every time you sat at my table, every time you helped Emerson with homework, every time Josephine said you were like family, you knew you had a warning and you didn't act on it. I said, yes. There was nothing else to say. Whitney said, I need to go. She hung up. I did not hear from Whitney for 5 days. I did not call her. I gave her what she had asked for the first time, which was space, and this time I did it right. On the 6th day, I got a text from Mario. He wrote, Mom's been crying a lot. She won't tell us why. Did something happen? I stared at that message for a long time. I wrote back, your mom and I had a hard conversation. I'm giving her space. She's a strong person and she loves you. Mario wrote back almost right away. He said, okay, I hope you guys are okay. You're important to us. I stared at that message until my screen went dark. Haven called that evening. She said, did you tell her? I said, I told her. Haven said, whatever happens next, you did the right thing. I said, the right thing, 11 years too late. Haven said, late is still better than from Dexter's mouth at a parole hearing. The parole hearing arrived on a Tuesday. I drove to the facility. Nobody had asked me to speak this time. I was attending as a member of the public. A door on the side of the room opened and Dexter was brought in by 2 officers. He was wearing a clean shirt. His hair was combed. He looked like someone who had spent the morning getting ready for a job interview. Dexter scanned the room the way he always scanned rooms, quick and careful, cataloging every face. His eyes found mine in the back row. Dexter's attorney went first. He described Dexter's programs, the anger management, the substance abuse counseling. He read from letters of support written by a prison counselor and a chaplain. Moses and Camelia were sitting in the front row. Camelia was crying already. The prosecution presented next. The prosecutor read from my previous testimony, the one from from 2 years ago, where I had described the 11 warning signs. Each one landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. I watched Dexter's face during the whole thing. Dexter did not flinch. Dexter watched the prosecutor with the same flat, patient expression I remembered from when he showed me his father's hunting knife behind the gym at 14. Not angry, not afraid, waiting. Then Whitney spoke. I did not know she was going to be there. She walked to the front of the room in a dark blue dress, and her hands were shaking, but her voice was not. Whitney said, "My husband Augustus was 34 years old. He was a construction worker. He was celebrating our daughter's graduation. He asked a stranger for an apology for spilling his drink, and that stranger stabbed him to death." Whitney said, "My daughter Josephine is 16. She will graduate without her father. My son Mario is 14. He builds things with his hands the way his father did. My son Emerson is 11. He does not remember his father's voice." Whitney turned and looked directly at Dexter. She said, "You have had 11 years to become a different person. I hope you have. I genuinely hope you have. But my husband has had 11 years of being dead. My children have had 11 years of growing up without him. And no amount of programs or counseling or good behavior changes the fact that you chose to carry a knife into a bar, and you chose to use it on a man who asked you to say sorry." Whitney sat down. The room was silent. Then the board asked if anyone else wished to speak. I did not plan what happened next, but my body stood up before my brain agreed to it. Dexter's face lit up for 1 second. Just one. I walked to the front of the room. I did not look at Dexter. I faced the board. I said, "Dexter Holland has been my best friend since I was 6 years old. I am not here to speak for or against his parole. I am here to say something I should have said a long time ago." I said, "I knew Dexter was dangerous. I knew it when we were 8. I knew it when we were 12. I knew it when we were 14, and he showed me a hunting knife, and I felt afraid, and I said nothing. I knew it when he was 19, and controlling his girlfriend, and I heard about it, and I said nothing. I knew it 30 days before he killed Augustus Whitman, because he told me he wanted to hurt someone, and I went home, and I did nothing." My voice cracked on that last part. I stopped. I let it steady. I said, "I have spent 11 years asking myself why I didn't act, and the answer is not complicated. I was afraid of him. I was afraid of him when I was 8, and I was afraid of him when I was 22. The difference is that when I was 8, I didn't have the words for it. By the time I was 22, I had the words, and I chose not to use them. That is something I will carry for the rest of my life." Then I turned to Dexter. His face was no longer warm. The tears were gone. What was left was the face from behind the gym, the flat, patient, waiting face. I said, "Dexter, you wrote me a letter. You told me I owed you. You told me you knew about Whitney and her children. You weren't asking for my help. You were threatening me the way you have threatened every person who has ever tried to hold you accountable. Magnus, Octavia, Petra, Lancelot, Augustus, and now me." Dexter's jaw tightened. I said, "I don't owe you my loyalty. I owe Augustus's family my honesty. And my honesty is this. You are the same person you have always been. You are just quieter about it now." I sat down. My legs were shaking. Camelia was sobbing in the front row. Moses would not look at me. Dexter stared at the table. He did not look up. He did not move. The board left the room to deliberate. When they came back and read their decision, parole was denied. After the hearing, I walked to the parking lot. Whitney was standing by her car. She had been waiting. I stopped 10 feet away. I said, "I understand if you don't want to talk to me." Whitney looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "You stood up in there and you told the truth about yourself. You didn't make yourself the hero. You didn't hide behind being young or not knowing." I said, "I should have done it 11 years ago." Whitney said, "Yeah, you should have." She paused. Then she said, "But you did it today, and my kids still need you around, and I still need a friend who tells me the truth, even when the truth is ugly." I nodded. I could not speak. Whitney got in her car. She drove away. I drove home. I did not turn on the radio. I thought about the letter Dexter would probably write me from prison. I decided I would not open it. I thought about Emerson asking me to describe Augustus's voice. I thought about how a voice is not something you can describe. It is something you feel. I got home. I sat in my driveway for a long time. Then I went inside. For the first time in 11 years, I did not feel like I was carrying it alone.